What's up, everyone? It's your boy, Mike Muse, from the Conversation of Mike Muse Show. I am so excited to be in conversation with my next guest. This is going to be an awesome show today. It just worked out timing-wise that it is Hispanic Heritage Month. And I booked my guest not even realizing it. And the only reason why we did it this time is because that's when schedules allowed. And so I'm super excited to talk all things Hispanic culture and media. I have someone who is highly regarded. I met one of her colleagues recently. We were on together on GMA3, and everyone in the building, from her colleagues I was on the panel with to the producers, the executive producer of GMA3, was like, "You gotta meet Stacie. You've got to meet Stacie. She's so smart." So I'm so excited that she is here in the building with me today. She is smart, folks, and I don't read bios, but I'm going to read just a little bit just so you can have an understanding of who we have here in the building today. Stacie De Armas, Senior Vice President of Diversity Intelligence Initiatives within Nielsen's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion practices. She's a subject matter expert in diverse audiences and content, focusing on data at the intersection of community, advocacy, and entertainment. You all know I love the D word, which is data. She recently, her and her colleagues and her team just put out this incredible report that is very thick but easy to navigate and it's entitled Fanaticals, a Nielsen's Playbook on Hispanic Audiences, Sports, and Media Engagement. I highly encourage you that you do check this out. You're going to gain some valuable insights into things that I didn't even know. So without further ado, please welcome Stacie. What's happening, friend?
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I've heard so much about you. I've watched your show. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited too. How did you nerd out on data? I love data. How did you begin to love data?
I have to say, probably 12 or 13-year-old me wouldn't have thought that I would be in data or insights or spreadsheets for that matter. But it kind of unfolded naturally. So I'm at Nielsen. My responsibility is combing through data with a wonderful team, one of my colleagues who you mentioned, and trying to find those insights that really tell stories about diverse communities that otherwise might not surface.
Yeah. And audience, you never see me with a pen. I actually have a pen just so we can go through. I've been marking up this research report because it is that fascinating. I want to pull out some numbers. But the beautiful thing of having you here, Stacie, today is that we're coming off of Emmy weekend. And I have to say, I really believe that this was one of our most diverse Emmys that we have seen, in particular across the board with Hispanic American representation.
Mm-hmm.
And something that stood out to me that was so important, which I couldn't wait to get you here because the data has a lot to do with this, was John Leguizamo. His Emmy speech to me was so moving. And I liked where he said in his speech, he says, quote, he says, "That's how we saw ourselves because that's all we saw. I used to watch Star Trek and think, wow, in the future, there isn't going to be any Latin people, but at least then the food will suck." Then he goes on to say, "And for years, I didn't complain about the limited roles my people were offered. The spicy sex spot, the Latin lover, the maid, the gangbanger. Turns out not complaining changed anything." Audience who's referencing the fact that he wrote a New York Times he took out a New York Times ad suggesting that the Emmys need to consider more Hispanic representation. And here we have the representation that was there. I thought that was very powerful about the future, and was looking at a show like Star Trek and saying that I couldn't see us in the future because we weren't in that show. That talks about the power of media.
It does. And I think, even though you saw good representation, we saw some wins last night. Representation across television is still pretty low, especially in English language television of Latinos. It's really just around 7%. And when we represent, 20% of the population. So it really was, I think, a rally cry, for the industry. John's speech was remarkable. I heard it too. We may be seeing more roles for ourselves, but by and large, the majority of television is really white. And so it was our data shows us not only do we looking at about 6 or 7% for Latinos across media when you break it, and that's streaming, linear, and broadcast, or cable, linear, and streaming. But when you break it down, you actually see that the majority of the representation is in streaming. So when you think about broadcast television and cable, there just really isn't a lot of Latinos, on the screen. I also took a look at that data against sports adjacent content. So who has the authority to report the sports to us? And, there's a lot of narrative around representation of Latinos in sports too, sports narratives. And there it's even lower.
Yeah, let me stop you right there because I wanted to talk about how we can use the data to counter narratives that Hispanic-based content or Spanish language, Spanish-speaking content or Spanish representation, Hispanic representation won't sell at the box office. And I think about that narrative of Black Panther really undid that narrative when it came to shows and films, in particular films that featured a Black cast. There was always this narrative that Black-led films couldn't sell overseas, and there was always that controversy where they wouldn't put Black people on the posters because it wouldn't sell overseas. But we saw that was completely busted with Black Panther, and that it broke all kind of records and shattered all kind of narratives. So we now have data. There was no research done on it, but we now have some empirical data that looks at the numbers and say, no, this isn't true. That misnomer, that trope isn't true. I'm wondering in some of the data that you guys are looking at, not into the sports yet, but when you look at the streaming and broadcast, does it offer insights to counter any narratives that the studio may have by not putting Hispanics in the leads?
Well, yeah, there's a few things. So one, and we covered this in our report, and it's something that we actually cover regularly at Nielsen. We look at this time spent with streaming, for example, that all adults spend. So we look at total audience, and then we look at Latinos, Asian American, Black, and Latinos are spending nearly 50% of their time with television on streaming. So we know there's this really strong appetite for content, right? For viewing content. We also know that there's, from a report we did 2 years ago, we took a look at not only time spent with content, but whether or not Latino leads in content in front of or behind the camera influenced consumption. And the answer there was yes. So we like to watch ourselves on television, number one, and not just on TV. I know we're going to save a little bit for sports, but the same was true for sports. I saw this really interesting, when I was taking a look at sports data, and it's okay if I just run ahead on this because I want to share this insight with you. I was looking at all the sports data for the report we put forward. I was doing some work for U.S. Open, and I thought, well, let me just take a look at what Latino viewership is overall to U.S. Open, the women's and men's singles finals over the past few years. And I saw this really interesting signal, this flare in 2021 women's final, and I saw the same thing for 2022 men's. And I went back and I thought, why is there this really significant, like a 20-point increase in viewership to the women's final 2021? And of course, there was a Canadian Latina who was in the finals, right, Leila Fernandez. But and it was enough where it wasn't just like, I thought, well, maybe who was the opponent, right? Like maybe what was the draw here that Latino audiences are coming? And I'm making a relationship here between sports and I'll go back to movies and content. But Latinos like to watch themselves in content, right? Not just in sports, but certainly on television. And we see that played over and over again. You mentioned this is true for all diverse communities. The issue, which was brought up at the Emmys, was that there just isn't enough. And so when there is content that features Latinos, each piece of content is really expected to be everything to every community, right? It's supposed to represent Puerto Ricans and Cubans, and each piece of content simply can't do that. There really needs to be more greenlighting of content, long-form content that represents our community.
That's where John made that joke about Mark Cuban. Would be Hispanic because his last name is Cuban.
Right.
And kind of getting to that. Like,
I'm Cuban.
But he was joking. Wait, Mark Cuban, is he not Cuban? I thought it was a joke that John was doing.
I think it's a joke.
Oh, yeah, I'm about to say, yeah. So I thought he was joking. Then I was like, oh, shit, are we serious? I'm curious about the idea of streaming for the Hispanic community. Why do you think that is such a growing trend within the Hispanic community?
I think the main reason, or one of the major drivers, is the youth of the community. So, the average age or the median age for Latinos in the U.S. is 31, and the median age for non-Hispanic white is 44. So that's your median. You're like, okay, that's, we're at the average. But when you look at the cohort with the most people in it for all Latinos from 0 to 99, it's 14. So that's the mode, right? The most common age for Latinos in the U.S. And for non-Hispanic white, that is 59. So it really kind of gives you the idea of where the swell of this bell curve is, right? You have the majority of people really between 11 and 23. And so that drives different behaviors, different consumption patterns, a lot of it driven by digital, and streaming content is right up there.
Do you think that is because when you look at platforms like Netflix and Hulu, I'm going to lean in more so to Netflix. I have more of an experience with Netflix when it comes to Spanish-speaking content. When you look at linear, you traditionally only think Univision and Telemundo, right? And you don't see many more networks, at least in the US, and then also to a diverse set of shows. But I've noticed, particularly within my algorithm, I get suggested a lot of Spanish-speaking films and series that are then translated or dubbed into English. And so do you think that streaming sites like a Netflix is giving more options? I'm sure there's much more that can be done, but do you think that's part of the draw to streaming?
I think that's part of it, but we also saw a lot of streaming, consumption from YouTube too. I think Latino audiences.
I saw that in your report,
Yeah.
but YouTube content is, for me, is different than Netflix content.
Sure. Yeah. Well,
Long form, short form.
But when you think about younger generations, I think about like my kids, for example. I think the appetite is a little bit different for long form and short form content. Like they're consuming shorter form content, and for them that is television. So it's that we're getting a little bit into social science here, but for them, short form is like TikTok. That's like 2 to 3 minutes. So medium sized content and what's available on YouTube is a big a draw.
Yeah, but I would think that this type of report would be able to help the narratives for films and studios to create also to short form content, but to also to engage with Spanish speaking audiences on long form content, because the data suggests that it will be watched.
Right, and it's not just about Spanish language content. So you were talking about Netflix, and you're talking about content that's developed in other languages, and then with closed captioning or whatever. We saw, look at the Emmys. We just saw Shogun. International content or content in any language is becoming, and we saw that, we've seen that with lots of other content. Narcos, and we can go back and back. So it's not just about Spanish language content. I think it's really about matching the appetite that Latinos have for good content. Some of it is English language Latino content where there's representation, but it's English language. We can think of some examples there. Some of it is Spanish language, but language is becoming more and more of and kind of an option. And so what I mean by that is Latinos are drawn to good content. When you've lived here in the U.S. Long enough, or for any length of time, over time you are adopting some of our language, right? And so when Latinos are consuming content in Spanish, it's by choice. We're saying, I want to watch this regardless of the language that it's in, because I can either subtitle it, I can watch it in Spanish or in English. There are more options available for Latinos. And a lot of the places that you find that unique content is going to be in streaming, not just Netflix, but all sorts of streaming content.
Stacie, I want to pause in the conversation because I need a little bit of a tutorial and an educational aspect of it, because even in the conversation, but I've always had challenges with this because we're living in a culture where we always want to be politically correct, right? We don't want to offend. We want to say the right things. And I've interchanged so much in this conversation, from Spanish speaking to Latino to Hispanic. What is the right thing to say? How is it the right thing to say? Is it Hispanic? Is it Latino? Do I say Hispanic diaspora? In your data, in your science, is it Spanish speaking? Because I did see that in some of the data aspect of it. Or is it just Spanish culture? Or do I say Latino culture? Or do I say Hispanic culture? So this is somewhat of a challenge. I want to make sure I get it right. And I think my audience, too, probably has the same questions, too, as well. In our aim to get everything right.
Of course. So I think Latino and Hispanic are used very much, right or wrong, and we'll go into some of the details, interchangeably here in the U.S. So people might identify as Hispanic or they might identify as Latino, but for the most part, they're sort of meaning the same thing. Now, technically, they're not exactly the same, but when it comes to Nielsen, we are obtaining population estimates from census. So in that case, we're getting what census identifies as Hispanic. I don't know if you recently have had the chance to be part of census, other than 2020. But I recently got in. They also Census is fielding surveys constantly, and I actually just got one about a month or so ago for their ACS American Community Survey. And in that, it gives you all of the options of how you can self-identify in census. So we're not forcing people into any box. People are self-identifying when they work with us, or of course, when they are working, with census, when they're providing their data to census. So that is Hispanic. Latino is technically coming from a Latin American country, which is different than being Hispanic, which would be, Spanish or Spanish-speaking origin. And then you have, Brazil coming. When you have other countries where people speak Portuguese, are they technically Latino or Hispanic? I will tell you, in our work and in our reports, we use Hispanic and Latino interchangeably because that is how people are comfortable with the data. That's how people talk about their identity here in the U.S. technically, census collects data on Hispanics, and there's a long history there with how that term was originally developed and who it's supposed to identify with. But those are, I would say, whether you say Hispanic or Latino in the U.S., you're being very sensitive to, encompassing Latinx. There's been a lot of dialogue about Latinx and or Latine, which is another term. People can certainly identify how they choose. I choose Latina or Hispanic, and I also, above all, I'm Cubana.
Yeah.
So,
so I think I should reference this study as like Hispanic culture, right? For content for Hispanic culture. Would
I
that
think
be
so,
a
yeah.
proper way?
Yeah, because
Okay.
we actually address both Spanish-speaking Latinos and English-speaking Latinos and bilingual Latinos. One of the things we cover in the report, too, is the fact that, 68% of Latinos in the U.S. today speak what we say some Spanish or better. So that leaves the other portion that are English language only. So you still have the vast majority that are very familiar with and speaking Spanish.
Audience, we just got an AP course in Hispanic and Latino media. I think it's very interesting because at the University of Michigan, I'm part of a committee where we're looking at admissions and trying to tackle the admissions rates of individuals of color. And that is something they have talked about, is that our Hispanic student population has increased. We're hovering around 7%. But the reason why it's increased is exactly to what you're saying. They're saying people are now self-identifying differently. And so we actually have seen an incredible increase in the Hispanic population. Obviously, those numbers are low. The Black population is hovering at 4 to 5%, which is not
and that's
good
University
as
of
all.
Michigan?
University of Michigan,
Yeah, I just went through that process with my second bird to fly the nest at Rice University, and they're doing pretty good with their overall Hispanic population. But everyone's, based on the decisions last year, we're all kind of looking to see that new admissions data roll out.
Well, we'll have to have you come back and talk about more about that at another time. But now that we can kind of dive back into the conversation, you did mention something interesting. So now I want to dive into sports. And my audience knows I love sports. And I think I love sports too, Stacie. We know you're not here to give sports analyst. I won't ask your predictions on Super Bowl or if Michigan's going to win a national championship game. But I am curious, just if we can, I think it's a good segue to kind of get out of the self-identifying, is the NFL in Brazil. We've seen the NFL definitely trying to grow their audience. Obviously, for economic reasons, we've seen them going to Europe, particularly within London, having games there. We just seen a couple weeks ago them enter into Brazil. And I thought that was a brilliant move to capture such a large population. Is that something that Nielsen would track in terms of the Hispanic category?
If the games are broadcast here, and they are, then yes, absolutely. It's interesting. The NFL and a lot of leagues and teams are really beginning to embrace their Latino audience, which was the purpose of this report we put together. One of the things I talk about in it is Viva Chiefs Kingdom, which is the road.
Saw that.
Isn't that so cool?
That was great.
A lot of folks aren't even aware of this really cool, two-part docuseries on the Chiefs' road to the Super Bowl, like, of course, right? Except for Mexico City and Mexico fans exclusively. Really great. And so, to better understand that these are global sports. So I think the NFL and others are doing a great job. The NBA too, like bringing in audiences and, expanding their footprint internationally. It just makes good business.
But I saw that, it reminded me of how they do the Hard Knocks. Before the NFL season kicks off, they'll follow a team. So I saw Viva Chiefs. I was like, oh, wow. And I happen to love Mahomes. And so
one of the things we talk about, too, in the report is the rise of like sports adjacent content. So, if you're going to make the commitment, it's a big commitment, like sitting down, the hours that you're going to commit to. And I hate to say commit, invest, right? In watching games. And there's so many leagues and teams to put your heart and time into. But sports adjacent content, again, thinking about younger audiences, really gives people the chance to, find out the stats, be part of the conversation without necessarily, if they don't have the time to invest. And so we saw this really incredible increase, like 38% more likely on TikTok to spend time, Latinos are, with sports adjacent content. And, again, back to the story, who has the authority to sort of tell us the story about the game? Who's talking about what's happening in the game, the stories that matter? Latino representation there is it's pretty low. I'm just going to say it like it is. And Latina is even lower. About 2.8% of the voices around sports adjacent content are Hispanic women.
So I kind of want you let me right to it. One, audience, Stacie has no notes in front of her. I'm the only one with the report with the pen and highlighting things. The way you are rattling off these data points, like with no notes in front of you, audience, when you look at this on YouTube, you will literally see she has no notes in front of her. I know it may seem like she's reading off of a teleprompter or something. Stacie, cheers to you. I want to literally just shout you out by how brilliant you are to be able to retain all this data.
Nielsen gives us a lot of resources.
Tough. It's really tough to have that on cue and to memorize.
Thank you.
So cheers to you for making this so conversational and so fun and allowing me and my audience to nerd out on data.
Oh my gosh,
Stats wasn't one of my favorite classes in college.
You know what, mine either.
You are like
Newsflash.
really making my damn, I should have read a little bit more in that class. But I do want to hit on the Latina aspect of that because audience, something I was kind of blown away by is when I saw they were focusing on, Nielsen was focusing on sports, I automatically just assumed soccer. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, there's going to be a growing audience within soccer, in particular with the Copa America and the UEFA Championship League finals. I was like, that's a given, the way that soccer, i.e. football, was kind of done. But
I have a good stat on that. I'm going to wait for you to finish your question.
Okay,
drop it for you.
Okay, yeah. But what I found so fascinating was that there's such a growing audience for the NCAA Women's Championship. And I feel like NCAA women's are having a moment right now in the last couple of years, in particular last year. And I think that momentum has increased into the WNBA. And audience, let me finally flex a little bit with some data. I can finally read something. It says NCAA Women's Championship skyrocketed by 354%. Overall, from 2016 to 2024, Hispanic viewership increased by an astounding 1,003%, reaching over 1 million Hispanic viewers in 2024. Now, I never had any data to support this, but I used to always yell, and I still am yelling at the NCAA Women's Basketball Association because I felt like they only focused on one player, right? And that was Caitlin Clark, right? And I love Caitlin Clark. She's a phenomenal basketball player, and she should have all of her flowers. Second, they will focus on will be Angel Reese, but the way they covered Angel Reese was always in this villain perspective.
Absolutely.
But I always said that they are missing the mark by not helping to grow the sport of NCAA women's basketball, but only highlighting 1 to 2 players, by not highlighting the entire league of incredible women athletes. And then that only helps funnel into the WNBA, which only help grow the increase. And I was excited that you saw here that you highlighted within your report 2 ladies that played for NCAA women's basketball tournament for Notre Dame, Hannah Hidalgo and Camila Cordoza. I have been talking about Cordoza throughout the entire tournament, right? And so I kept saying that this is a loss for the NCAA by not highlighting other women, in particular at the WNBA draft. I'm like, why did we spend the first 15 minutes on the draft on Caitlin Clark? I get it, we should.
Yes.
But when you look at these numbers, reaching over 1 million Hispanic viewers, 1,003% increase, that's data that supports my argument for yelling at the league of why they need more coverage and representation, because clearly the numbers are there.
Well, I think everyone talked about, there's no secret that everyone consumed more NCAA women's, right? Everyone was watching more. But to watch that Latinos kept pace, and just between 21 and 24, this 354% increase was remarkable. But we actually saw Latino increase to a variety of sports. And even, this narrative is really about the increase in viewership and engagement in what would typically maybe be considered like niche U.S. sports culture. I mentioned earlier U.S. Open. We saw the same thing with Wimbledon. We saw that like across the bar. And it wasn't just like, well, there's more Latinos, so of course there's going to be more viewership, right? It's going to raise one thing's going to raise, of course the other's going to raise. No, we actually saw multiple percents, hundreds of percents increases in some cases. So it really tells us 2 really cool things. One, that Latinos are beginning to really make their mark on what would be considered traditional U.S. sports culture. But in the same way, Latinos are influencing U.S. sports culture. The stat you mentioned earlier on Copa and UEFA Euro, everybody, this year, the narrative was just hotter than ever. Everybody watched more, right? Yeah. But what we saw is Latino audiences, when we compared 2016 to 2024 for which one do I want to focus on, UEFA or Copa? Let's look at Copa, right? When we looked at those two, the audience went from 73% total audience, 73% Hispanic in 2016 to 53% in 2024. So right off the bat, you're like, oh, that sounds like a decrease. Yeah. It's actually not. It's an audience composition, right? So the numbers were hundreds of percent higher, but the composition changed, meaning you have 47% of that audience that was non-Hispanic white toward Copa this year. Wow. Whereas in the past, it was not, it was barely 20-some%. So this tells me that Hispanic passion toward Hispanic niche sports culture, which might be Copa and UEFA, is now bleeding into U.S., like must-see U.S. sports culture. Really interesting to see the non-Hispanic white audience balloon as a result of the passion from Hispanic fans. So we saw that in both ways. We saw it to U.S. niche, college
women's
sports, college women's basketball. And then we also saw it for like Latino niche. Super cool to have this impact on both sides.
It's almost like one is informing the other. Right, which I think goes back to our earlier conversation, how we started out. Like a lot of this is being formed by the younger Hispanic population and demographic who are more digitally natives, right? And also, too, who enjoy streaming and, to your point on YouTube, short form content. And I think that's partly because if you look at the way the NBA has been promoting the league and the NFL has been promoting the league, and particularly when it comes to fantasy football, I think fantasy football is driving a lot of this. Yeah. But also, too, I think the brackets are informing a lot of this, but that is all about like engagement, right, and active use, right? It's almost this gamification aspect of it. And that's all on the digital platforms. And so if Latinos, in particular young ones, are in that space, I can see how they can be attracted to engage and want to participate.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time. And in the report, we go over some of the digital engagement. There's a partner piece of work that we put out with a company called Latinos in Sport that released about a week before this one. And we cover some of those digital trends a little more in depth. But absolutely, the digital engagement is beyond, and it's multiple times over when you think of Latino audiences to total audience. So really using their phone or digital connectivity to engage more in the game than we see with with non-Hispanic audiences, which tend to be a little bit older. So it makes some sense there.
You got to come back because we didn't even get a chance to get to the Lionel Messi effect. I thought that was really fascinating in the report. Really quickly, if you could just highlight what that is. I could do a little bit.
So one of the things we wanted to look at was, and it's actually a really cool, the whole page is dedicated to it. Please look at it. Yeah. But one of the things we highlight in here is Lionel Messi's impact overall on MLS and viewership. So for Apple TV, there was like a 300% increase. Of course, you would expect a lot of folks coming to watch, to watch Messi, but obviously really good business decision for them and the MLS package. But interestingly, a lot of those games are also available on Televisión Univision. So I guess if you didn't have the package, there's a lot of ways to watch the game, the game's either in English or in Spanish, but essentially his entry into MLS has changed the face of MLS for all the teams, for the whole league.
It is.
I can, more stats in the report, but I'd love to talk about that
more.
More.
As we conclude, I'm thinking about how we started with John Leguizamo, and he talked about if you don't complain, nothing happens, right? I'm paraphrasing. And he went into action and he did something. And based upon his account from last weekend, he was discussing there's some change that's happening at the Emmys. You and I talked about so much more to go. What do you hope this report would do, right? What do you hope this report will inform?
So, I think overall, when we think about this report is really around sports. It's around media and entertainment and viewing, but it's around Latinos as fans and really the changing of or the evolution of American sports, right? What matters around sports viewership, I should say, sports engagement. So what I hope this report does is helps brands, media companies, leagues, and teams think differently about the U.S. Latino consumer, the fan, right? Whether it's a 2-part docuseries on the Chiefs, Road to Super Bowl, out of Mexico, whether it's thinking about how we engage with brands for games that are played internationally in other markets, specifically because we're driving Latino audiences. That's the goal here. I think typically there's a lot of ways to engage with fans beyond, right? There's whether it's digital platforms, in-game, there's so many ways, but the Latino fan has not necessarily been at the center of it. So what we're trying to do with this piece of work, pardon me, is highlight the fact that Latino fans are not only central to the evolution of the game today, but they're really driving what is going to happen with the game and with fanship and fandom over the next 10 to 15 years.
And that is content too as well, right? Because these leagues are doing so much of content that they're pushing out to get the fans engaged 365 and not just
consumer.
on game day. Stacie, you are brilliant. Thank you for giving us an AP course in anthropology studies of the Hispanic diaspora, as well as another refresher on my stats course in college. So thank you. You got to come back on the Mike Muse Show again.
I'd love it. Thank you so much.
Gotta
Pleasure.
have you again. Congrats on the study.
Thank you.
I have a question. I know we've been talking a lot about sports, and we have been talking a lot about content and different viewing habits. I'm just going to throw an outlier out there. The audience is not here to talk about this, but I'm just curious if you have anything about viewing habits regarding the debates.
Yes, so we do. So the second debate drew 67 million viewers. But what was really interesting is we decided to break it down, and credit where credit is due. This is my wonderful colleague, Charlene Polite-Corley, who highlighted this for me. In a number of individual markets, the debate actually did better. More people watched, more Latinos watched than the Super Bowl. So
what?
You heard it here.
That is huge.
It's huge, but it really goes to tell you how Latinos are engaged and really, wanting to be part of this conversation and know where they should stand in November. So in New York, for example, 5.5% higher viewing for Latinos than the Super Bowl. Same thing in New Orleans. A couple of standout markets. In New Orleans, it was actually 10%. Now, when you look at those numbers, though, then we're like, okay, so what are the demographic of these folks? Largely, it's Latinos over 55 that committed more time and more, energy to the debate, the second debate, than they did the Super Bowl. But still, really remarkable at how important this conversation is for America and Hispanics.
Audience, you can't see my face right now unless you're watching this on YouTube, but the way I am making these facial expressions is mind-blowing, because this is all we're talking about is a sense of what is the Hispanic demographic. What are they going to do? How are they going to vote? Making sure they're engaged. Both sides, Republicans and Democrats, are doing their best to draw out the Hispanic population for the get out the vote efforts that is happening. Yep. You mentioned two areas of New York and Louisiana and New Orleans. Those aren't battleground states. But what I am pulling out of that is that you said most of those are over 50 years old. That's prime voting age, where people generally tend to vote higher within that age category. And if you think about the scale of that, although those two areas specifically, I'm sure there's more to be pulled out, are not technically battleground states, there is this connectivity of communication, right? Where you will debrief, you will post something on social media or on Facebook. You may call a family member that lives in Florida or Texas or Michigan or Pennsylvania, right? And
WhatsApp.
And really begins to create a dialogue. I think that right there is something I'm sure both campaigns will be unpacking post November 4th as they look at the numbers and the exit polling and what happens. But I think what you just said right there is a very powerful moment.
And I actually just got this, so I should poke through it a little more to take a look at those battleground states. We saw the same thing for Black households too in Chicago. There, for example, more viewership than the Super Bowl. So that was about 3% higher.
And that just shows just how engaged politically these demographics are.
That's right.
There's this misnomer that I believe that totally checked out, which I disagree. Highly engaged participants in our democracy. I just never have the data to prove all the things I'm saying.
I'll leave it with you.
Thank God I have you.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks.